Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Denver International Airport, Gate C42, 9:12 in the morning. The boarding line for Vantage Airlines Flight 1N83 to Charlotte moved in that slow, shuffling rhythm unique to early departures, the kind where nobody has finished their coffee and everybody is still deciding whether they like the person seated next to them. Dr. Adrian Caldwell stood near the back of priority boarding, a gray wool coat folded over one arm, a simple black tote slung across her shoulder. She wore no logos, no obvious labels, nothing that announced itself. Her boarding pass, Seat 2A, was tucked into a plain leather passport case, the kind you could buy at any airport kiosk for $30. She looked to anyone glancing her way like a woman heading to a Tuesday morning meeting. That was more or less the point. She reached Seat 2A at 9:19, settled her tote beneath the seat in front of her, and opened a folder of documents on her lap. Around her, first class filled in slowly. A businessman in a navy suit took 1C, already scrolling through emails with the particular urgency of someone who believed his times cost more than everyone else's. An elderly couple settled into 1D and 1F, the woman adjusting a cardigan, the man reading a paperback western. By 9:24, the cabin held the low murmur of a flight not yet ready to leave. At 9:26, flight attendant Dana Pierce stepped into first class with a clipboard in hand, counting heads, matching faces to a seat manifest she had glanced at only once. She was efficient in the way people become inefficient when they've stopped questioning their own assumptions, moving down the aisle with the confidence of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that confidence read as competence. She reached row 2 and stopped. "Ma'am," her voice carried an edge already, "this is first class." Adrian looked up from her folder. "Yes," she said, "I know. I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Dana's eyes moved over Adrian's coat, her plain tote, the folder of papers, cataloging all of it in under 2 seconds, and arriving at a conclusion she had clearly already reached before asking the question. Adrian reached into her passport case without hurry and handed the boarding pass over. Dana studied it for longer than the document required, turned it once as though checking for a watermark, then handed it back with a small, tight motion that landed against Adrian's knuckles harder than a boarding pass return needed to. "You understand economy is back through the curtain," Dana said. "Some people try to walk up here thinking nobody will check." A few heads turned. The businessman in 1C lowered his phone half an inch. "I have a ticket in this seat," Adrian said, her voice even. "You're holding it." "I'm holding a piece of paper," Dana said, loud enough now that row 3 could hear her clearly. "Paper can say anything." She turned, half addressing the cabin, half addressing an audience only she could see. "We get this sometimes. Folks think if they just sit down fast enough, nobody will ask questions." Nobody laughed, but nobody objected either. That silence, Adrian had learned a long time ago, was its own kind of answer. By 9:31, Dana had pulled her personal phone from her apron pocket and angled it toward herself, thumb hovering. "Hey everybody, it's Dana," she said into the camera, voice brightening into performance. "Got a little situation up here in first class this morning. Thought y'all might want to see how we handle it." The little red dot in the corner of her screen blinked to life. 14 viewers. Then 31. Then 62, climbing the way numbers climb when something starts to feel like a show. This is the part of the story where most people expect the shouting to get louder. It doesn't. It gets quieter, and quiet is almost always more dangerous. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to gather your things," Dana said, turning the phone so the lens caught Adrian's profile. "We don't have time for this before pushback. I'm not moving," Adrian said. "I bought this seat." "Sure you did." Dana rolled her eyes for the camera, and the gesture got a ripple of laughing emojis in her stream chat. Security to gate C42, she said into her headset microphone, not breaking eye contact with the phone screen. Non-compliant passenger, row 2. At 9:34, 2 Denver airport security officers came up the jet bridge, boots loud against the metal ramp. The lead officer, a stocky man named Diaz, reached row 2 and looked first at Dana, not at Adrian, the way people naturally look first at whoever is standing. She won't move to her assigned seat, Dana told him, refusing to comply. Officer Diaz turned to Adrian. Ma'am, we're going to need you to collect your belongings. Adrian's phone, resting face up on her tray table, lit with a text. She glanced at it, then typed 3 short replies, one to an assistant, one to a name saved simply as legal, one to a contact labeled board chair. She set the phone back down without comment. The businessman in 1C had his own phone up now, filming with the practiced angle of someone who had done this before for entirely different reasons. This is unreal, he murmured to his seatmate, loud enough to be picked up on the recording. Trying to sit in a seat she clearly didn't pay for. Nobody had asked him. He said it anyway. That's usually how it starts, one voice deciding it speaks for the room. The elderly woman in 1D leaned toward her husband. They try this every so often, she whispered, not quietly enough. It's a shame, really. At 9:37, 10 minutes before scheduled departure, Senior Flight Manager Todd Bregman arrived from the jet bridge. Clipboard under one arm, tie slightly loosened from a morning, already going wrong somewhere else on the concourse. He scanned the cabin, landed on the small crowd, gathered near row 2, and asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. What's the holdup? Passenger in the wrong seat, Dana said, her voice smoothing into something more professional now that a supervisor stood in front of her. Won't move to coach. Bregman looked at Adrian. He was 15 years into this job, and 15 years teaches a person to trust certain instincts, some of them useful, some of them not. He saw a woman in a plain coat with a plain tote and no visible jewelry, and something in his gut, trained by pattern rather than fact, told him this matched a story he'd heard a dozen times before. Ma'am, may I see your identification and boarding pass? Adrian handed both over without a word. Bregman studied them. The pass reads Seat 2A, First Class, purchased 11 days earlier for $2,940.17. The identification read Dr. Adrian Caldwell, an address in the Cherry Creek neighborhood of Denver. Everything matched. Everything was in order. And still, Bregman held on to his doubt the way a man holds on to a decision he's already made out loud in front of an audience. These look legitimate, he said slowly, but we've had some sophisticated forgeries come through recently. I'll need to verify through central booking. It wasn't true. He needed a reason, not a fact, and he'd found one that sounded official enough to survive a challenge. At 9:39, the captain's voice crackled faintly through the intercom system from the flight deck, something about a brief delay, words that didn't yet mean anything to the people crowded around row 2. A young woman in seat 3B, headphones around her neck, leaned forward slightly. I saw her boarding pass when she got on, she said, quiet but clear. It said first class. I was right behind her. Nobody responded to her. Bregman had already made his decision. And decisions made out loud in front of a crowd have a gravity of their own, one that pulls a person forward even when the ground underneath them has started to shift. Ma'am, Bregman said, given the delay and the need for verification, I'm going to ask you to deplane. We can rebook you on the next available flight. That's when Adrian Caldwell reached into her coat pocket, unhurried, and everything that happened after would be recorded from 4 different angles by 4 different phones. Each one certain it was capturing something small. 6 minutes past scheduled departure now, and the cabin had gone quieter than it had any right to be for a plane full of strangers. What she pulled out wasn't a badge, wasn't a threat, wasn't even where everyone could see it right away. It was a single business card, matte black, plain except for embossed gold lettering, and she set it face down on her tray table with 2 fingers resting lightly on top, as if she weren't quite ready to let the room see it yet. Mr. Bregman, she said, her voice no louder than it had been the entire flight so far, Before you finish that sentence, I'd recommend you ask Captain Whitfield to come back here personally. Bregman blinked. Ma'am, I have full authority over passenger matters. The captain doesn't need to be involved in every dispute. Some disputes need his direct attention, she said. This is one of them. Officer Diaz shifted his weight. Ma'am, regardless, we need you to comply. Adrian's phone buzzed against the tray table. Legal emergency line, the screen read. She declined the call without glancing at it twice, and something in that small, unbothered gesture landed on Bregman differently than anything she'd said so far. Emergency legal lines were not the sort of thing ordinary passengers carried in their contacts. At 9:44, Dana's live stream chat had climbed past 200 viewers, and the tone of the comments had started to shift from cheering her on to asking questions she didn't have answers for. What's the card say? Why's the manager sweating? This doesn't look right anymore. A second flight attendant leaned into first class. Captain wants an update. Tower's threatening our slot. Tell him 30 seconds, Bregman said, though he had no idea if that was true. The young woman in 3B had a clearer angle on the card now than anyone else in the cabin, and when she caught a glimpse of the gold lettering beneath Adrian's fingers, her mouth opened slightly and nothing came out. She looked at the man across the aisle in seat 4C, a heavy-set man in a Broncos cap who had been quietly watching the whole exchange with his jaw set tight. Did you see that? She whispered. See what? He asked. She shook her head, unable to explain it yet, because she wasn't sure herself what she'd seen, only that it had made her stomach drop. Bregman finally reached his breaking point in the worst possible direction. Ma'am, final warning. Gather your things or security will assist you off this aircraft. That's when the flight deck door opened. Captain Alan Whitfield stepped into the cabin, silver-haired, 53 years old, 31 of those years, spent flying commercial routes across the country. A man who had seen every version of an airport dispute there was to see. He scanned the crowd around row 2, and when his eyes reached seat 2A, he stopped walking entirely. Everyone step back from this row, he said. His voice had a different weight than Bregman's, the kind of authority that comes from decades rather than a title on a badge. Now Officer Diaz and Bregman both stepped back without quite understanding why. The businessman in 1C caught the captain's expression on camera, and later, aviation forums would slow that footage down, frame by frame, trying to name exactly what crossed his face. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition arriving a full 10 seconds too late to undo any of it. Whitfield crouched slightly beside seat 2A. Dr. Caldwell, he said, quiet enough that only the first 3 rows caught it. I am so sorry. There's been a serious misunderstanding here. Adrian looked up at him with the same calm she'd carried since 9:19 that morning. Captain, I appreciate you coming back, but I think this has moved past a misunderstanding. She glanced toward the forest of phones still recording around her. As you can see, it's been fairly well documented. Whitfield's jaw tightened as the scope of that sank in. 4 separate live streams, dozens of phones. A story that would exist on the internet within minutes whether he wanted it to or not. Ma'am, he said, please accept my apology, and the airlines. Captain, Adrian said, and for the first time there was something almost gentle in her tone. I believe you know who I am now. The question is what you're prepared to do about it. She turned the card over. Larkspur Aerospace Holdings. Dr. Adrian Caldwell, founder and chief executive officer. The businessman in 1C read it aloud into his own live stream without meaning to, his voice trailing off way through the sentence as the number of viewers in his chat tripled in under a minute. Larkspur wasn't a name most passengers would know, but anyone who worked in aviation knew it instantly, the way you know the name of a bank that holds your mortgage. Whitfield's face had gone the color of the cabin walls. 31 years of flying had taught him exactly which names mattered, and Larkspur Aerospace was one of the 3 largest aircraft leasing companies operating in North America, holding more than $11 billion in commercial aviation assets. I had no idea, he said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to. Clearly, Adrian said. She lifted her phone, opened an app that displayed live aircraft registration data, and turned the screen toward him. This aircraft, tail number N738LV, is currently leased to Vantage Airlines through Larkspur. Contract value, $612 million annually. Term 7 years, renewable in 18 months. The young woman in 3B pressed both hands over her mouth. She worked in aviation insurance underwriting, and she understood immediately what those numbers meant, in a way most of the cabin didn't yet. This woman didn't just own the plane's paperwork. She controlled a piece of the infrastructure that kept the entire airline flying. Dana's live stream had climbed past 400 viewers, but her narration had gone silent for the first time all morning. She stood frozen near the galley curtain, staring at the card like it might rearrange itself into something less catastrophic if she looked long enough. This has to be fake, she finally managed. Anybody can print a card at a copy shop. Officer Diaz, Adrian said, turning toward him with the same steady patience. Would you like Larkspur's 24-hour verification line? They can confirm my identity and the lease relationship in under 2 minutes. Diaz looked at Whitfield, uncertain for the first time in his career which direction the authority in the cabin actually pointed. Captain, your call. Whitfield pulled out his own phone with visibly unsteady hands. This is Captain Whitfield, employee ID 6214, requesting immediate verification on Larkspur Aerospace Executive Leadership. He gave the tail number. He waited, and the 11 seconds of silence on that call felt considerably longer to everyone listening. While he waited, Adrian kept speaking, calm as still water. Mr. Bregman, your passenger service manual, section 14.2, requires verification through official channels before any accusation of fraudulent documentation. Was that protocol followed here? Bregman opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Everyone in the cabin already knew the answer. Furthermore, she continued, glancing at her phone, Vantage's employee social media policy, updated 4 months ago, prohibits live streaming passenger interactions without consent from everyone involved. Miss Pierce has been broadcasting this to several hundred strangers without my permission, which is both a company policy violation and, depending on jurisdiction, a possible privacy law issue. Dana's face drained of color as she remembered, with sudden clarity, that her stream was still running. The confirmation call connected. Captain Whitfield, a voice said, audible to the first 3 rows, Dr. Caldwell is indeed our founder and CEO. She's traveling to Charlotte for a partner board session. Is there a problem with her flight? Whitfield closed his eyes. No problem, sir. Routine verification. Thank you. He ended the call and turned to Adrian with an expression that mixed genuine shame with something close to fear. Dr. Caldwell, on behalf of this crew and this airline, I am deeply, sincerely sorry. But the morning wasn't finished delivering surprises yet. Adrian reached into her tote and produced a second card, plainer than the first, and somehow it landed harder. Brookstone Capital Partners, she said. I'm the managing partner there. We hold an 11.8% equity position in Continental Sky Holdings, Vantage's parent company. Third largest shareholder on record. The cabin went silent in a way that silence rarely manages on a crowded airplane. The businessman in 1C actually laughed once, a short disbelieving sound, before catching himself. She doesn't just lease you the plane, someone in his chat typed. She owns part of the company that hired the woman who insulted her. 14 minutes past scheduled departure now, and nobody in first class was thinking about the delay anymore. Dana finally spoke, her voice thin. I was just doing my job. Anyone could have made that call. The cabin turned toward her almost as one body. Whitfield's expression went from apologetic to something considerably harder. Mrs. Pierce, Adrian said, and her voice never rose, not once, doing your job doesn't include deciding, based on a coat and a tote bag, that a paying passenger doesn't belong in the seat she purchased. It doesn't include filming a stranger without consent, and it certainly doesn't include telling a cabin full of people that I was trying to scam my way into a seat I own the plane under. Whitfield's phone rang again. He answered, listened, then held it out. Regional Director wants to speak with you directly. Adrian took the phone. This is Dr. Caldwell. A pause. Yes, I'm aware. No, I haven't left the aircraft. It's been recorded from at least 4 angles that I can count, probably more that I can't. Another pause. Longer. I'm not interested in a settlement check, Director Sloan. I'm interested in what happens the next time this crew meets someone who looks like they don't belong somewhere they've every right to be. Director Patricia Sloan's voice, tight with controlled panic, came through clearly enough that the front rows caught fragments of it. Full investigation, immediate action, whatever you need. 3 things, Adrian said. Ms. Pierce is terminated for cause, effective today for the accusation, the filming, and the policy violations. Mr. Bregman is suspended pending retraining on verification protocol since he escalated without following it. And Vantage issues a public statement naming what happened here for what it is. There was a pause on the line, then done, all 3 within the hour. I also want your executive team to implement mandatory bias recognition training across every customer-facing role, a off-incident reporting system with direct executive visibility, and a quarterly report to Larkspur on outcomes. Since our lease renewal conversation happens in 18 months, and I'll want to know whether this was a lesson or a headline. Dana's face had gone rigid, somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of real fear. This is insane, she said. You're going to end my career over one interaction? You ended it, Adrian said, not unkindly, just factually. The moment you decided a stranger's worth could be judged by her coat before you'd checked her boarding pass. I only made sure it had consequences. Sloan's voice cut back in through the phone. Mrs. Pierce, you're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you off the aircraft. The finality of it landed on the cabin like a change in cabin pressure, felt more than heard. Dana's face crumpled, the practiced authority she'd carried since 9/26 collapsing into something much smaller. 17 minutes past scheduled departure, and the man in seat 4C finally stood up. Dr. Caldwell, he said, I want you to know some of us have been in that exact seat before. Different words, same look on somebody's face. We just didn't have the resources to fight it the way you just did. Several passengers murmured agreement. The elderly woman in 1D, who had whispered her quiet approval of the whole ordeal 20 minutes earlier, sat very still, staring at her folded hands. Sir, Adrian said to him, thank you, that's exactly the point. Most people who go through this don't have a business card that changes the room. They just have to live with it. She looked around the cabin, at the phone still half raised, at the faces now uncertain of where to look. That's the actual problem. Not that this happened to me, that it happens constantly to people who can't make a captain apologize in front of witnesses. The businessman in 1C lowered his phone slowly. I owe you an apology too, he said. I called this a scam before I even saw your ticket. I recorded it because I was sure I knew what I was watching. You did know what you were watching, Adrian said. You just had the wrong person cast as the problem. Whitfield checked his watch, then seemed to catch himself and set it aside entirely. Dr. Caldwell, whenever you're ready, we can proceed to departure. Take whatever time you need. At 9:52, 31 minutes past the scheduled push, Officer Diaz escorted Dana Pierce down the jet bridge in silence, her Vantage lanyard still around her neck, unused now, a piece of costume from a role she no longer held. She didn't look back at the cabin. Later, she would tell a local reporter that she still didn't fully understand what she'd done wrong, that she'd only been following instinct. That instinct had never failed her before on that jet bridge. The reporter would ask her gently whether that instinct had ever been tested on a white passenger in a plain coat. She wouldn't have an answer. The young woman in 3B, Camila Reyes, raised her hand slightly like she was back in a classroom. Will there be somewhere for passengers to report something like this in the future? If it happens to someone without your resources? There will be, Adrian said, a direct line reviewed by executives not buried in a comment box nobody reads. I'll make sure of it personally. Whitfield addressed the cabin over the intercom before the doors closed. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for what you witnessed this morning. It does not reflect what this crew or this airline should stand for, and changes are already underway to make sure it isn't repeated. Applause started somewhere near row 4, uneven at first, then spreading forward through the cabin. Even the elderly woman in 1D joined in, eyes wet, her earlier whisper apparently louder in her own memory now than it had been in the moment. Adrian stood briefly and addressed the cabin herself. "This wasn't about me getting an apology," she said. "I'll get plenty of those today. It's about what happens to the next person in this seat who doesn't own the company that leases the plane. If you remember one thing from this morning, remember that silence in a room like this one is its own decision. It has a cost, even when it feels like the safe option." The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 10:04 a.m., 39 minutes late, carrying one fewer flight attendant than it had that morning, and in a quiet, unglamorous way, carrying the beginning of a different set of rules for every flight that would follow it. 6 months later, the numbers told a story of their own. Vantage Airlines reported a 71% drop in passenger discrimination complaints company-wide. The new incident reporting system had processed over 900 cases, with the overwhelming majority resolved within 24 hours under direct executive review, a stark contrast to the old system that had let complaints sit unanswered for weeks. Larkspur Aerospace expanded its lease agreement with Vantage by $290 million, the largest single increase in either company's history, a decision director, Sloan, later called, in an internal memo, "the most expensive lesson in trust we've ever paid for, and worth every dollar." Gary Holloway, the businessman from Seat 1C, became an unlikely part of the story's second act. His original video, still online with its awkward, half-apologetic narration, was folded into Vantage's new employee training program as a case study in assumption and bystander behavior. "I learned that recording something isn't the same as understanding it," he said in a follow-up interview. "I judged her before I ever looked at the actual ticket in that flight attendant's hand." Officer Diaz was promoted to lead a newly created passenger advocacy division within airport security, working directly with civil rights organizations, to redesign how de-escalation and identity verification were taught to frontline staff. Camila Reyes left underwriting within the year and started a small consulting firm focused on discrimination prevention in the travel industry, a decision she traced directly back to the 40 minutes she spent in Seat 3B, watching a stranger refuse to raise her voice. Even Eleanor Voss, the woman from Seat 1D, found her way into the aftermath. At 68, she joined a newly formed passenger advisory board at Vantage, offering the perspective of someone who had, by her own admission, let assumption speak louder than fact. "I'd like to think I would have stopped myself sooner," she said in a brief statement to a local paper. "I didn't. That's something I have to sit with." As for Dana Pierce, her path afterward was quieter and considerably harder. She spent several months working retail, telling anyone who asked that she'd been made an example of, that people did worse every day and never faced consequences. Eventually, months later, she enrolled in a diversity and workplace conduct certification course, not because anyone required it, but because, as she put it in a short interview she gave almost a year after the flight, "I had to actually sit and understand what I did, instead of just being angry that I got caught doing it." She never fully agreed she deserved to lose her job over it. She did, eventually, agree that the passenger in Seat 2A had never once raised her voice, and that had unsettled her more than any amount of shouting would have. Dr. Adrian Caldwell went on to establish the Fair Passage Foundation, a nonprofit offering legal support to travelers facing discrimination on commercial flights. In its first full year, the foundation handled over 600 cases, achieving policy changes or resolutions in the significant majority of them. 2 additional airlines adopted versions of Vantage's revised verification and reporting protocol within 90 days of the incident going public, and industry publications began referring, somewhat informally, to the new standard as the Caldwell Protocol. None of it, Adrian would say later in one of the only interviews she agreed to give, had anything to do with revenge. I wasn't trying to punish an airline, she said. I was trying to make sure the next person who sits in a seat they paid for doesn't have to carry a business card in their pocket just to be believed. Funny. That's the part of this story worth sitting with longest. Not the reveal, not the numbers, not even the apology delivered over a cabin intercom at 10:02 in the morning. Funny. It's the quiet, deliberate choice to turn one bad interaction into a system that protects people who will never have a black card with gold lettering to fall back on. Funny. Real change rarely announces itself with shouting. More often, it looks exactly like what happened in seat 2A that morning. Someone staying calm long enough for the truth to catch up to the room. Funny. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment you witnessed and stayed silent through, or one you lived through and had to carry alone, share it in the comments. Funny. Tell us what you saw. Tell us what you wish someone had said. Subscribe for more stories about quiet power, dignity under pressure, and the kind of change that starts with one person refusing to raise their voice. Funny. And the next time you see something happening to someone else that you know isn't right, remember that silence has a cost too. Funny. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. Funny. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Funny. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. Funny. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.